Again, hello from our side. We will be starting in just a minute. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our event, Digital and Diplomacy. Depending on where you are based, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's fantastic to see such an interest in this event and even in the build-up, this interest in digital and diplomacy from all around the world. So from our side, we massively appreciate it. My name is Dr. Katharina Höhne. I'm the Director of Research at Diplo Foundation, and I will have the pleasure to moderate this event and spend the next 2 hours with our excellent speakers who together have been called a dream team of digital diplomacy, and of course, spend the next 2 hours in conversation with you, our audience. So the key question we're asking today is digital and diplomacy, what are we actually talking about? And we are posing this question to open up conversation and then to work towards reducing confusion around the term. And our speakers are scholars and practitioners in digital diplomacy, and together they represent various perspectives, but also different generations when it comes to those who practice and study digital diplomacy. We are also using this opportunity to look back in order to look ahead. We have a special anniversary today. So this year, almost to the month, marks 25 years since the publication of Information Technology and Diplomacy in a Changing Environment, written by our director, Dr. Jovan Kubalia. And this publication appeared in the famous discussion paper series in the Diplomatic Studies program at the University of Leicester in 1996, so quite a while. There's also a second 25-year anniversary that deserves mentioning. Ambassador Amma Agivaili, now Ambassador of Egypt in Serbia, wrote about the information revolution and international relations in one of the first, if not the first, publications on the topic in Arabic, also in 1996. So we have 25 years to look back on, and we're using this to then from there look ahead, because since then a lot has happened in scholarship and practice, and our speakers today are really testament to that. And as always, we can ask, perhaps a lot has changed, but perhaps also a lot has stayed the same. But we shall see about that in the conversation with our speakers. There's also a sense that the term digital diplomacy has gained massively in popularity. And in order to illustrate this, let me just give you some insights from our friend Google, if I can. Let me see. On the trends in digital and diplomacy. So what you're seeing here on the screen are the trends for the last 25 years when we talk about digital and diplomacy. And you can see various terms and how these terms gained and lost in popularity. And basically, digital diplomacy is not only trending, but it seems to be one of the most dominant terms. And then when we zoom in to the last 12 months, this is really confirmed. If you look at all the searches on Google, digital diplomacy makes up more than 50% of the searches and the results that we see on Google. So clearly, there's a lot of prominence around the term, and clearly, there's a lot to be unpacked. So we really take this as our starting point. Let me briefly tell you how we conceptualize this at Diplo. So at Diplo, when we talk about digital and diplomacy, we use a typology consisting of 3 parts. We look at digital as a tool for diplomatic practice, digital as a topic on diplomatic agendas, and digital as something that impacts the environment in which diplomacy is practiced. And this typology goes back 25 years to this initial paper by Professor Jovan Kubalia that I mentioned. And basically, Jovan, I want to give you the floor to kind of share your reflections on those 25 years, but also perhaps on this typology and its relevance. So over to you, Jovan.
Sure. Thank you, Kat. It's really great to be today here with this dream team, and really a great combination of speakers and practitioners, which should help us to unpack and understand what we are discussing. Now, it is not just academic issue. It is very practical issue, because many ministries of foreign affairs are navigating this confusion between cyber, digital, tech diplomacy. And when we discuss it, we don't want to act like French Academy with French language of making the proper use of term, but it is very important to understand when we use the term what we are referring to. And it inspired this first paper in 1996, and this sort of tripartite methodology, which focused on environment for diplomatic activities, question of geopolitics, geoeconomics, strategy, question of new topics on diplomatic agenda, what diplomats are addressing, whether it is cybersecurity in the first committee, on digital health just next corner to this building, or e-commerce. Therefore, they have to address new issues or old issues in the new framework. And then this usually new topics are now framed in digital foreign policy, internet governance, digital governance, and those related issues. And then we have new tools for diplomatic practice. And here in the paper in 1996, and today we anchor it into the core diplomatic functions according to the Vienna Convention. It's always good to go back to the core document, whether it is a charter or Vienna Convention. And in Article 3, you have those functions to negotiate, to represent the interest, to inform the public, to foster the peaceful relations in the world. Here we have the special, let's say, broad developments, and here you have Twitter diplomacy, Facebook diplomacy, all prefixes that were used up to the latest Zoom diplomacy. Now, I hope that during today's discussion, we can increase the understanding when we use the term, let's say, cyber diplomacy. Do we refer only to cybersecurity negotiations or something else? Now, over the 25 years, there were few developments, and I can categorize them in the more or less quiet period. The first websites, 1995, FCO, State Department. Later on, obviously 9/11 and big shift towards security. 2004 UN government group of experts and discussion on cybersecurity. And they dominated and pushed for the term cyber diplomacy, which was mainly related to security. And then when people came with the trade issues, with human rights issues, they said, what we are going to do as a prefix? Is it cyber diplomacy or digital diplomacy? And then confusion was further accelerated when more or less all interplay between digital and diplomacy was reduced to social media and PR, especially after Arab Spring and Facebook, Twitter diplomacy, and those issues. The latest period was marked with the tech diplomacy, which Danish diplomacy introduced, with the main focus on promoting diplomacy and interest of the countries in the Silicon Valley and the hubs of technological developments. I know that academics in this room, researchers, were focusing on these issues from geopolitical, practical, protocol, PR, social media aspects. This tripartite methodology has been influencing our courses, and what was very interesting, it was also basis to understanding and research on history of evolution of diplomacy, with the introduction of telegraph, telephone, radio communication, and everything else. And you can see that throughout the history, not only in our last 25, 30 years, you had always that interplay with the telegraph, impact on the geopolitics, which remain more or less same as till our very moment. Probably if you are based in India, communication between us and you is going through one of the cables which are probably passing through Suez and more or less following all the telegraph cables. Telegraph came also on the agenda with the adoption of the establishment of International Telecommunication Union, the oldest organization, and it became tool of diplomacy. We know the famous saying from Palmerston when he received the first telegram, "This is the end of diplomacy." Obviously, diplomacy survived, but that remains quite sort of clear and well-tested way to frame this interplay between technology in general, but in particular, internet and digital on diplomacy in its comprehensive approach, and ultimately clearing confusion when it comes to research, teaching, and practice. And I will close with the following point. Recently, well, before COVID, I visited one country which had 4 departments for cyber diplomacy, for digital diplomacy, for tech diplomacy, for e-diplomacy. And at that point, I was asking all heads of this department what was it all about. And one of the reasons is that digital and diplomacy is sort of in topic and everybody wants to be associated. Therefore, within the ministry, in the turf battles, everybody wanted to be associated with this latest. And it created enormous confusion. At the end, I was asked by minister to clarify how to navigate internal dynamics. And it was a clear realization in practice that this confusion should be sorted out, not without imposing one definition, but asking always what we refer to when we use terms cyber diplomacy, digital, e-tech, virtual, online, and other issues. Over to you, Kat.
Thank you, Johan. Let me just echo this very last bit that you said as also the kind of motivation for our event today. It's not about imposing a particular definition. It's about clarifying what particular perspective you are taking or what you are actually referring to. I think this is a very good kind of motto for our discussion today. Thank you also for bringing in the kind of functions of diplomacy and for reminding us of the Vienna Convention, because this is really what in essence we are talking about. And then when you referred to the predecessor of the ITU, you almost took us back almost, I want to say 150 years. So we have a huge time frame there. And then lastly, you introduced a kind of timeline of different phases of digital diplomacy. And that's something we will come back to in the discussion, especially in our first panel. So I'm really looking forward to see this kind of conversation unfold there. Without further ado, I would like to get into the discussion. But first of all, let me turn to you, our audience, and remind you that we're trying to make this event as interactive as possible. I've already seen quite a number of comments, questions, suggestions in the chat here in Zoom. So please keep that coming. If you're joining us on YouTube or Facebook, please also submit your comments and questions there. We will bring all of them back into the discussion. But in terms of making this event as interactive as possible, I have a second suggestion or a second kind of request for you, because we would like to hear your opinion. And for that, I turn to Mentimeter. Some of you have already used that. If you haven't used it, you basically go to menti.com and you type in the code you see here on the screen. It's 83787102. We will also put this information in the chat. And we basically ask you to describe digital diplomacy in 3 words. What are the 3 words that characterize digital diplomacy for you? We will keep this kind of survey with you running throughout the initial conversation in the first panel and then return back to it. So as the conversation unfolds, please feel free to come back to this and add your thoughts and basically your notes, so to speak, on digital diplomacy as the conversation unfolds. So it's menti.com and the code is 83787102. We already see some words coming in. So as I said, please keep them coming and we will come back to this in about 20 to 30 minutes. And I will be very curious to see how this conversation here unfolded by then. But Yeah, in terms of conversation, I think it's time to get into our first panel, and it is my pleasure to introduce the scholars and practitioners that we will have on our first panel. So we have Ambassador Amma Al-Ghivaili, who is the ambassador of Egypt in Serbia. We have Professor Cornelio Bjoiler, who is Associate Professor of Diplomatic Studies at the University of Oxford. And he heads the Oxford Digital Diplomacy Research Group. And Oxford Digital Diplomacy Research Group is also a good reference point for many of us who are interested in digital diplomacy from an academic perspective and to kind of further these conversations. We also have Mr. Sean Rierden. He is the director of the Chair for Diplomacy and Cyberspace at the European Institute of International Studies, and he is a former senior British diplomat. We also have with us Dr. Ilan Manor. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Communications at Tel Aviv University and a visiting fellow at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. So it is my absolute pleasure to enter into the first part of our conversation today with these four speakers. And well, let me get into the discussion by turning to Ambassador Al-Ghivaili, especially because in the beginning I mentioned the paper he wrote 25 years ago on the impact of ICT on international relations. And I think this is an excellent starting point for our conversation with this idea of looking back in order to look ahead. So basically, Anna, turning to you, can you give us some hints on the key points you made back then and what is still relevant today, perhaps, and to what extent your perspective has changed, especially since there are 25 years of practice in between then and now. So I'm really interested to start with your reflections on this.
Thank you very much, dear Dr. Katharina Hun. I'm most pleased to participate in this distinguished panel and online event. I'd like to thank, of course, Professor Jovan Kurpaila for the invitation. And it's always a pleasure to participate in Diplo events that are always looking ahead, but also with a good foundation in history and in evolution of the thoughts. So 25 years ago, you remind me of how old actually I'm getting, both Jovan and I. A group of diplomats and researchers gathered to actually write what was then, I believe, the first thematic issue of Al-Siyasa Dawliya International Politics, which is the #1 periodical in the Arab world in that field. And we devoted it to the impact of the information revolution on international relations. I think there were about 10 to 15 contributions in that regard. Mine was more of a theoretical introduction to the whole issue theme because I was co-editor of it. And part of that theoretical introduction was actually on diplomacy and what we called the Infocom revolution, because at the time, I think it was clearly identifiable that the transformational change is both in telecommunications and in information. Now I think we see some convergence as there is more reliance on the soft part, on the information technology part, rather than more of the infrastructural, hard technical aspects of it. But I did not know, unfortunately, Jovan then. I hadn't the pleasure to see or to meet him at the time. But apparently, even before we meet in person in Geneva, there was some telepathy in ideas and in interest. So I'm very, very glad to be celebrating his first publication, which or his publication on the topic, which you kindly shared with us on the screen. What's interesting is that yes, as much as this new development of an additional space, the cyberspace, that new dimension that we're discovering in our social interaction in general, is allowing us to explore new methods, means, and to achieve, or to aim to achieve, new objectives, as much as the physical presence still remains as relevant. I'll tell you why. I'll give you a concrete example. Had this invitation to participate been from another institution other than Diplo, I would have probably not been able to participate. Why? Because I am still at the moment accredited to a physical space, to a country called the Republic of Serbia. And since Diplo has a physical presence in Serbia, and has an office that is very active and forward-looking, then still, as I could respond to that invitation, because the invitation has come from an institution or an entity that has a physical presence in Serbia, even if that whole mode of interaction and all of us are participating through an online version of us, should we say. So there still is that important combination and fusion between what is a physical space and what is a cyberspace, and I think it is characterizing more and more the undertaking of the role of diplomacy. But also, I think it's useful to say that that fusion and that combination of spaces is not only to the platform of interaction, but also even to the contribution. So I am obviously an acting diplomat, but also I think I'm participating here more in my personal and academic capacity, since we're discussing also an intellectual contribution that was brought forward to the literature, particularly Arabic literature, 25 years ago. So increasingly, I think we are discovering that we cannot separate those two dimensions, those two spaces, the physical space, the material space, and the virtual cyber or electronic space. And this new environment in which we're living is becoming part of our both virtual and physical reality. I'm preparing for this contribution, I haven't had much time, but at least what of in the preparation was very helpful is that I really looked at that section called actually Diplomacy and the Infocom Revolution in that paper that you kindly referred to, because now of the new tools available that weren't available in 1996, I could easily translate it through Google Translate, and I will be happy to share with you and with the participating community the English version of it after a bit of editing. So yes, as you mentioned in the introduction, sometimes, as the French say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it changes, the more it's the same. But also sometimes plus ça change, plus ça change. The more it changes, the more we discover that there are new changes that are available. Particularly that the tools are becoming much more powerful than they were in 1996 when Jovan contributed creatively with his paper and when I tried to explore that additional dimension. So yes, we do identify those three perspectives, those three pillars of ICT as a tool, ICT as part of the agenda, and ICT or digital as tool, digital as agenda, and digital as environment. Indeed, some of the basic premises remain the same. However, the intensity of interaction, the reach of that potential has become much bigger than ever before in 1996. In particular, if we speak about digital as a tool, and that was a major, I think, part of the that study that I was involved in and published, we discovered that what is needed maybe 25 years later, and in this we should benefit from the established UN practice that they have, the Population Conference +5 or +10, or the World Summit Information Society +5 or +10. It is an important milestone when we revisit our own thoughts and see whether they were tested, and now that they've been tested, whether some of those arguments and hypotheses prove their remaining relevance or not, and often more often than not, I'm happy to say that they did prove relevance even across time space. So one idea that was shared in that paper was, yes, we're talking about digital diplomacy, the ICT impact on diplomacy as a tool, but here it's important to know that diplomacy, after all, as a profession or as a function, is a space where more than one institution contributes to. So of course, the diplomatic machinery represented by foreign ministry is one, but it's important also to see how foreign ministries compared to other institutions that contribute to the foreign policy making have adapted ICT as a tool or not. It's almost like a race, whereby we see the different professional cultures, how they were able to absorb that tool and integrate it into their machinery and not. And I see that there has been some differential impact, and it's worth exploring it to see how, for example, the foreign trade machinery, the diplomatic foreign ministry machinery, of course, the defense yes, the defense policy machinery and so on and so forth have been able to adapt and absorb that tool differently, and then to see and analyze why they have been able to do so through their professional culture. When we speak about this digital as agenda, we now see that it has, I think, been much more mainstreamed in the agenda of multilateral diplomacy, and I think even bilateral diplomacy. The frequency by which we hear and listen that digital issues have been discussed between foreign policy officials, between diplomatic channels, and bilaterally, or more so even on the multilateral front, has become much more clear than before. 1996, there were none or very few, but 2003, 2005, it has become a core issue, or at least much more salient issue on the UN agenda, with the convening of the World Summit Information Society in 2003 in Geneva, 2005 in Tunis, both of which phases Jovan and I have had the pleasure and I think the honor and the experience to contribute to. From there on, you could find that this digital as issue, as agenda, has more or less been embedded very high on, or relatively high on the agenda of diplomatic talks, be it bilateral or multilateral. I think now there is almost, maybe, as Jovan has mentioned, maybe there's been a dispersion or fragmentation of that issue, so that it's discussed in so many different forms. In the first committee of the General Assembly, obviously the aspects related to security, but also the second committee has of the General Assembly has an established resolution on the more on the economic developmental aspects, and so on and so on and so forth. If we speak about digital as environment, and that is how it has helped shape the context in which diplomacy takes place, also we see that obviously the level of interaction has become much more frequent and intense, and that the use of or the interaction, the engagement of diplomacy with that wider environment has become much more apparent, and particularly through that instant interaction with through the social media and with the social media. So diplomacy has become much more public than it was before, basically reflecting the development that we see through this information society or information age. In my professional activity, almost after each meeting there is a tweet, even if that tweet is only a photo, but it has almost become expected, that level of transparency, that the wider community, that the wider audience, the wider public has a right to at least be informed of a diplomatic activity in its form, even if not of its substance. Of course, the degree of substance that is shared varies from one diplomatic machinery to the other, from one even diplomat to the other, but it has almost become an expectation that at least for the audience, for the public to be informed of the encounter, of the engagement, of the activity itself. And that, I think, was not there in 1996, simply because some of those tools were not present, were not invented in 1996 in the first place. So the answer probably to your question is both. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The basics are still the same in terms of the impact of that information age on the conduct of diplomacy, but also plus ça change plus. You know, the more it changes, the more it even changes more, because the multiplicity of tools, the complexity of how these tools interact together still creates every day a new environment in which we have to deal. So very glad to be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the publications together, but not very happy that it's been 25 years. You know, it's maybe too long to count in our professional and personal lives. Looking forward to your insights and that of all the speakers and panelists, and we'll be happy to interact further as we go into our interesting discussion. Over to you, Kat.
Thank you so much for these great reflections, again spanning 25 years, and this is basically a review, right? This is the review conference right here. Just a quick reflection, and you mentioned digital or opening up a new space, like questions around cyberspace and this interaction between our physical space and the digital space. And this was really well picked up in the questions and comments that we received so far. And this is certainly something we will come back on in the discussion, especially with Sean Rierden, because I remember my discussions with him going in a similar direction. So this will be very interesting. Towards the end, you mentioned quite a number of really important points regarding tools and digital diplomacy as a tool, and especially the use of social media. So these have also been really well received in the chat, and I think this is an ideal opportunity to bring in our next speaker, which is Professor Cornelio Biola, and he is a scholar in Oxford, and really focusing on digital diplomacy, and the way I understand his focusing on digital as a tool for diplomatic practice. So it will be fantastic to hear from him. And again, I come to him with a kind of overview question. And in this case, basically, Cornelio, how you would describe and see the changes in practice we've seen over, well, the last couple of years, decades. And perhaps from your perspective, are there specific stages of digital diplomacy that you would identify? And if I can remind everyone, in the beginning of this event, Jovan also introduced a number of stages. So it will be really interesting to hear from you, Cornelio, in terms of what is digital diplomacy for you, and can you identify different stages of basically practicing digital diplomacy?
Thank you very much, Katerina. Thank you very much, Ivan and the Diplo Foundation, for inviting me again, to speak to this event. I'm very happy to be part of this distinguished panel. Again, thank you for the participants, for the questions already raised in the chat room. I think the question that Jovan raised at the beginning, also Ambassador before, about the meaning of digital diplomacy, it's an important one. When I worked on the first volume of digital diplomacy in 2014 with Marcus Holmes, we started. There was terra incognita. There was nothing available in terms of understanding what was going on. And now, 7 years later, talking about the history of digital diplomacy, I think it's an interesting transformation, because it speaks a little about an important element of this transformation: the speed of the transformation. That everything has taken place very fast. So just connecting the idea of speed to going back to the question raised by Jovan about the meaning of digital diplomacy, my answer, what I'm going to say today, my answer is that digital diplomacy has evolved and is evolving fast. And that creates confusion, because it's not that the meaning is not stable. There are different layers or laminations that are being added as the practice evolves. And let me illustrate that, in the next 5 minutes or so. How do I think the meaning of digital diplomacy has evolved from in the past 10 years or so. And I think it's going to continue to evolve. And that speaks to the maturity and also to the richness of the practice of digital diplomacy. And I think, though, just to use a visual, one that I think it captures well this kind of transformation is this famous diagram produced by Gardner. Gardner has this idea that technological innovation doesn't evolve in a linear fashion. It evolves rather differently, starting with the technological trigger, right? The technological innovation aspect. And I think this is what we've seen in around 2016, 2017. For 3-4 years, there was this explosion of social media. And I think that the trigger at that point was the Arab Spring. When Ministry of Foreign Affairs, yes, we had Ministry of Foreign Affairs before, the UK FCO, the US State Department, UN, and a few others, developed social media accounts. But it was after the Arab Spring, when you see this kind of explosion of inflation, everybody wanted to be online. And there was an expectation at that time that by jumping on the social media wagon, you are able to shape perception of millions of people in real time. That was a point of attraction. So during this period, digital diplomacy very much associated with one single thing: social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And that was the bulk of the everybody was talking in that sense. After the Arab Spring, we have training units established by ministry. The digital diplomacy, in that sense of using social media, has become professionalized. Everybody wanted to use social media, first for public diplomacy, then a little bit for crisis communication, and later on a little bit they touched on international negotiation. But the core meaning for digital diplomacy was social media. Guess what? Around 2014, 2016, the bubble bursted. And I think Sean was part of that discussion when he was very critical of the use of social media and losing track of what happened, especially in the diplomatic offline engagement. But there were another set of events that triggered that type of bursting of the bubble. It was the rise of the dark side. It was the propaganda. It was the fake news. The referendum of Brexit, the US elections, the rise of Daesh we all using social media, not to promote collaboration, but also to tear things down. So we have this kind of throw of disillusionment, of disappointment, in which things, at that time, there was a different layer added. Not only social media, but Ministry of Foreign Affairs started to talk about strategic communication as a way of dealing with the dark side, the way of dealing with the propaganda and fake news. So on the original meaning, social media, digital diplomacy, we see a second layer, strategic communication. Strategic communication is a tool that has infused the work of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They develop new units. Think about the Stratcom units of the European Action Service and FCO. They have dedicated units dealing with the dark side. After the throw of disillusionment, we see something else happening. And I think it's already mentioned. Well, government calls it the slope of enlightenment. Maybe yes, maybe not. But we see another set of developments. First was tech diplomacy. The rise of tech ambassador, Kasper Klinger, but not only, there are about 20 tech ambassadors at the moment. And that inaugurated a different layer. The idea of developing diplomatic relationships, with big tech companies. Why do you want to do this as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs? Because you want to attract investment, because you want to be able to control certain narratives online if you have stay close to them. There was a lot of impetus, a lot of push for developing this kind of new layer. Some of them, I said, about 20 countries developed that, and it worked pretty well. Interestingly, tech diplomacy also created something else, which you see nowadays, especially in Europe, being put on the agenda, the idea of digital sovereignty. The idea that digital diplomacy, in a sense, is not only about social media, strategic communication, and tech diplomacy, but also protecting what? Your sovereignty, meaning data flows, because it has digital sovereignty has two components. One is about the data flows, the GDPR, the privacy, all the flows that can go in different jurisdictions, but also the technological side, the digital infrastructures with the 5G, the Huawei, and all that type of story that we've emerged. So we hear now the slope of emerging in a different direction. Another layer, tech diplomacy, being added to already two other laminations. Where are we now? The pandemic, in which a third layer has been added, the virtual engagement with Zoom and the Teams and all the other things that I think some of them are going to persist after the end of the pandemic. So it's not only about using social media, it's not only about coping with the digital propaganda, it's not only engaging with the big tech and protecting your sovereignty, but also now using virtual immersive medium to conduct negotiations. There was a lot of skepticism at the time, right, in 2020, when Ministry of Foreign Affairs International migrated on Zoom. But after 1 year, we see that it actually worked pretty well, right? Diplomacy hasn't stopped. Meetings have continued to take place. Yes, there are limitations and so on. Where are we now? We are on the brink of another transformation in which we see, and Katerina has been publishing, writing on this, the rise of AI. This is a new layer of digital diplomacy, which is different than social media. It's different than the strategic communication. It's about decision making, in which digital diplomacy is about how you use digital technology to improve your decision making. So we are now moving in that area. So I think what we see, if the Gardner story it's accurate, what we see is that from this explosion of social media and disillusionment, we are entering a phase of more maturity. Maturity in which Ministry of Foreign Affairs are more cautious now about jumping on any digital bandwagon, but also more immune to the possible setbacks that they may come from this and that. I think they are more mature, more sophisticated in their approach. So from this point of view, seeing these kind of different layers being added one to another, I think the best is yet to come for digital diplomacy as a profession, as it continues to become more professional and mature in its approach. So I'm going to stop here just to give some time for the others to comment as well.
Thank you, Cornelia. It's fantastic to kind of have this point, the best is yet to come, as a perhaps guiding principle for our conversation here. I'm looking forward to get into that. Your reflections on the tools really got some attention in the chat, and it's fantastic to see the conversation developing there. Also, it really resonated with what Ambassador Ayvali said in terms of artificial intelligence and the kind of the speed of developments and kind of catching up with the speed of developments. You already alluded to kind of current issues and some of the key topics and key themes that we are facing right now when we talk about digital diplomacy that are hot on the agenda, but also kind of future trends as they are coming. And this brings me to our next speaker. I want to ask Ilan to kind of deepen the conversation a little bit there in terms of, in your opinion, what are the key issues right now, but also what are the kind of future trends in digital diplomacy? We already heard AI, we heard misinformation, counterterrorism perhaps. So are these some of the issues that we need to start looking at, or that practitioners and scholars start to focus on? And perhaps you can give us an impression of the future as well. Over to you, Ilan.
Well, thank you, Kat, for inviting me to partake in this wonderful event. And thank you for all of the speakers who have spoken thus far. When looking at digital diplomacy and what comes ahead, I think that there are 4 key issues that we should probably be looking at. The first is managing the relationship between nation states and big tech companies. Now, many people have talked about the need to regulate tech companies. The Economist a while back argued that data is the new oil. And if the US was able to regulate and break the monopoly of Standard Oil, it will probably be able to break the monopoly of Facebook. But at the global level, there seems to be a need for cyber or digital accords that create an international normative framework that regulates both big tech and that also regulates governments' use of big tech towards nefarious activities. And this is related to the issues that you just mentioned: terrorism, counterterrorism, disinformation, propaganda. Is a cyber offense tantamount to war, etc.? Second, Learning from the past, I think that diplomats should now begin anticipating and preparing for the next wave of digitalization. If the past 25 years have taught us anything, is that diplomats often lag behind society and private entities in embracing and leveraging digital technologies. So diplomats must now begin to prepare for the next wave of digitalization. For instance, foreign ministries need to think, what will the technological landscape look like in 2025 or 2026, and how can we prepare? And this landscape will likely include virtual reality, augmented reality, and maybe even holograms. And I think it's incumbent on diplomats and diplomatic institutions to work with local tech companies to examine how each technology may be used to advance diplomatic goals, but also how these technologies will challenge diplomacy, because deep fake or fake virtual reality environments can warp public opinion and limit digital users' ability to make sense of their world. A third key issue, I think, is the risk that diplomats will come to view the public as a problem. And when you talk to diplomats already now, many of them view digital users as especially susceptible to digital manipulation, digital propaganda. And in this way, the public almost becomes a problem because diplomats need to secure the digital surroundings of their citizens. But viewing the public as a problem might undermine the basis of relationships between diplomats and publics, which are supposed to be rooted in facing shared challenges together. In other words, viewing the public as a problem, which will only increase in the future, may undermine decades of public diplomacy activity. And I think that a fourth key issue deals with trust in diplomacy and diplomatic practices. And in recent years, the international system has become increasingly paralyzed. The UN has been unable to end the wars in Syria and Yemen. The OSCE has been unable to reduce tensions in Crimea. And the EU is struggling to reach consensus on foreign policy issues, not to mention that the COVID has seen the resurgence of national borders, national policies, and critique of multilateralism. Now, digitalization, I think, can help in part restore faith in the multilateral system through increased transparency of diplomatic processes, through offering digital publics access to diplomatic negotiations once they have concluded, and enabling digital users to take an active part in diplomatic processes. And the ITU, for instance, is one organization that currently crowdsources white papers. So it actually enables people all over the world to take part in drafting white papers and policy recommendations. And this, I think, is a step in the right direction. The last thing I would say is, if we're learning from the past, Cornelio spoke a little bit about the institutionalization of digital tools, how diplomatic institutions come to embrace and possibly leverage digital technologies. And if we look at the last 25 years, we see that there are usually 4 or 5 stages, and this will probably be true for the next wave of digitalization. In the beginning, we have the digital mavericks. So these are individuals within foreign ministries or within a UN organization who decide to take a giant leap forward. For instance, in the UK FCO, you had some ambassadors who early on used Twitter to amass hundreds of thousands of followers. So the mavericks are the ones who kind of show the way forward. Then you have when foreign ministry decide to institutionalize the use of digital technologies by creating guidebooks and creating working routines. How do we use a certain technology? Who can use it? To what end is it used? This actually usually occurs following crisis. The next stage is training and actually teaching diplomats at different levels how to implement new technologies. Then you have the stage of best practices, which is when an MFA says, oh, this ambassador is doing an amazing job. Let's replicate what he's doing and teach all other ambassadors how to follow in his footsteps. And finally, you have the tricky stage of trial and error, where you basically enable diplomats to use new technologies. This leads to successes, this leads to high-profile failures, but the foreign ministries who best leverage digital technologies are those who are willing to learn from mistakes and who don't fear mistakes. So just a few thoughts about where we've been and where we're going. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, from our perspective, this comment about the need for training and capacity development is, of course, very, very welcome, and that view is very much shared. Your comment on public as a problem has been picked up in the chat, and there's some discussion evolving around there. And also for our second panel, when we have a number of practitioners, I'm also very curious to see their reflections on how they are adapting to new tools and how they see the challenges ahead. For now, thank you so much for the contributions. I now turn to Jovan for further reflections and perhaps for some of the questions, comments, and discussion we've seen in the chat so far. Jovan, over to you.
Thank you, Kat. It's really great discussion. I think the cloud behind me is becoming less confusing. We are adding more concrete points. What was interesting in great points by Cornelio Ammer, and is the already that different perspectives which could be framed around the political environment, geostrategic environment, topics, and the tools. There was a heavy focus on tools, which was obvious. Is the most important. And a few underlying questions which came also in discussion from Sean and others. Is the social media with this strong cancel culture, strong polarization, healthy for diplomacy? Should and can diplomacy shy away? And Angelica mentioned the point that it's risky for diplomats because there will be bigger gap between diplomats and public. I have to give benefit of doubts to diplomats. They tried very hard with social media. But now it's a real question if their core function to represent their country, to have a peaceful solution of conflicts, is endangered by this cancel culture of social media. Should they stay or should they adjust? That's, I think, one of the underlying issues in this field. We'll definitely hear more from Sean on geopolitical environment. He wrote heavily a lot on it. And that was, let's say, a bit weaker aspect so far in our discussion because tools were discussed in depth. Amr brought, importantly, question of the topics. Iron brought also the question of the need for the new cyber accord. Do we need it? It's a very controversial issue. Can we negotiate? To what extent? I spent quite a bit of time at the UN seeing the limits of it, but that's an important issue. Therefore, it's really shaping nicely, less confusion or confusion on a higher level. We'll see it.
Thank you. This is a good keyword to turn to Sean Rierden, who has an extensive body of scholarship, but also this background as a senior diplomat. So quite an interesting mix. And one interesting question, especially when we talk about digital tools, and especially when I listened to Ilan and this kind of need to adapt for diplomatic practice, one thing I'm always wondering, and one thing that came up in a number of conversations we had is there a danger in all of this of losing sight of diplomacy or what diplomacy is at its core? What is your reflection on this, basically?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up something that, well, first of all the general thank yous, and can we take those as read, and I'll move on. I'd like to pick up on something that Cornelio said when he said he thought that the best was still to come. And I have to say, I hope so, because I think diplomats have been pretty useless in using digital tools up until now. I think one of the reasons that diplomats have not been very good at it is that they've got far too focused on the technology. And as you suggested, the diplomacy has got lost sight of. The diplomacy, what we're trying to do through diplomacy, why we do diplomacy, and the basic approaches of diplomats hasn't actually changed. And they haven't changed since Lord Palmerston, who was wrong about the end of diplomacy in the 19th century. And they haven't changed since Harold Nicolson in the 1920s said the telephone meant the end of diplomacy. Diplomats are still essentially doing the same kind of things. I would add one to Jovan's list, because he referred to the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and not to the one on consular relations. I actually think it's in consular work that we've seen the greatest innovation and the greatest imagination by diplomats. They've been far better at making innovative use of social media in consular work. But I think the trouble with using new technologies or using digital technologies in diplomacy is because we've forgotten what the diplomacy is for. Because we've not focused on that, we've got terribly excited about new technologies, about social media platforms, rather than thinking about this is what we're trying to do. How can we use new technologies, whether it's digital, whether it's AI, whether it's anything else? How can we use that to get better at doing diplomacy, to get more effective at doing diplomacy, rather than getting excited by all the technology? And I think traditionally, I think Jovan would agree with me here, traditionally, diplomats have functioned because it's a particular approach to international problems. It's not the only approach to international problems. It's not the only approach to managing international relations. We have activists, we have NGO groups, we have politicians, we have the military, who all have their way of engaging. But diplomats have a particular way of engaging. One aspect I think is very important of that is the ability of diplomats working on the basis of interests to hold conversations, to maintain conversations with those with whom they disagree, with those whose values they do not share. And this is an essential element of diplomacy that can easily get forgotten. And it's, Jovan mentioned, we've had this discussion in the chat, that if you start going very public, one of the dangers of public diplomacy is that by becoming public, you undermine your ability to talk to people you don't agree with. That every time you're seen to be having a conversation with someone whose values we don't share, and we might radically not share those values, it may be a representative country that's carrying out a genocide. But once you're seen to be, through social media or other public diplomacy tools, to be talking to these people, you're then rendering yourself open to quite violent criticism, and it undermines the ability to do the job, undermines the ability of diplomats to stabilize international relations. I think perhaps to conclude, I'd point out that the important diplomacy still goes on behind closed doors and is not broadcast on Twitter. The important conversations that enable diplomats to manage those international relations are still going on in private. I was once asked when talking in Diplomatic Academy, do I need to be on Twitter? Do I need to be on social media? My response was, and this was a political, an ambassador very involved in political work, and my response was, only if you've got time when you've finished having lunch with the private secretary of the foreign minister. And I'll leave you with that thought. Lunching is more important than social media.
And thank you, Sean. Really interesting, but also slightly provocative comments, which again is reflected in the chat. Which brings me to basically kind of ask the question for the ambassador on our first panel, Ambassador Agivaili. What is your reaction to what Sean just said? 100% agreement from your perspective, or some slight qualifications there?
Thank you, Kat. I think I'm both participating as diplomat and as an intellectual as well, so that gives me a bit of a space to handle that. But I would agree with Sean and what he mentioned, that it's important to see what diplomacy was expected to do. What are the main functions of diplomacy, and then see how ICT and the information age has impacted that or not. So I think, the four main functions of diplomacy. One would be representation. Second is negotiation. A third is information gathering or reporting, and the fourth is servicing the expatriates or those abroad. And if we take those essential functions of diplomacy and see how tools and issues and environments impacted by the digital world, and that gives us a good prism of analysis, a good point of departure for analysis. So how digital has impacted the function of representation, how it has impacted the function of negotiation, and there are now quite a few studies on particularly how online negotiation has enhanced or has limited the ability to reach outcome and positive outcome at the end. Same on the reporting aspect. And here we come to the issue I think raised by a couple of speakers, how AI is now integrated or not so as much integrated into the information analysis and from there into the decision making. And finally, I think also has how Sean has mentioned the impact on servicing the expatriate community or those living abroad. And here I think ICTs has enhanced the ability to reach out and to communicate and interact with the community living abroad, but also some of the services that the consular section are asked to do are now being much easier to do through using ICT as a tool, because most of these tasks, most of these services are not in the hands of the foreign ministry in the first place. They're in the hands of, let's say, the Ministry of Interior for issuing passports or so. They're in the hands of Ministry of Labor in terms of and Ministry of Justice in terms of authentication and certification. So I think the tool of ICT has serviced well the interaction with the community. As well. So it will be interesting to see, some of those classic studies on what traditional quote unquote diplomacy was asked to do, and then to simply juxtapose the information communication environment and see how that's impacted each of these functions. So in that aspect, I agree with Sean. On the other aspects, I may not fully concur, but that's normal and it's part of the healthy debate.
So Katerina, just to comment a little bit on Sean's point as well, because I think I agree with Sean on one aspect in terms of the social media. This is what I said, that this conflation of social media and digital diplomacy is not productive. There's been a lot of emphasis on social media in the early stages, 2010, 2013. Things have moved on. Just to give an example, for instance, what is the hottest topic nowadays in terms of negotiations? Not necessarily behind closed doors, but negotiation. The question of data flows. There was zero agreement about cross-border data flows in 1960. In 2017, there are 90 treaties. If you go to a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is in charge with data flows agreements? Barely find anyone. So data, digital things, digital infrastructure have moved to the fore of diplomatic activities. So social media is one element. It's been there, it still continues because it's the issue of dealing with public perception. But digital diplomacy is much more than social media. That was the point I was trying to make about the digital years to come. Ignoring AI, it's a Brexit thing. You shoot yourself in the foot. Ignoring the possibility of understanding how AI can actually assist diplomacy and investing. Finland has done some work, and a few other countries, Singapore is leading the way. It's about the ability to harness a lot of information inside that comes from the data. Yes, some diplomats or more old-fashioned cannot understand what is, as Sean pointed out, they don't understand how AI can work. But that's not an excuse not to do it, right? It has to move forward. So the point I was trying to make here is that things are moving. Digital diplomacy has become more nuanced and is evolving. So sticking with the social media aspect, despite its importance as it is for some Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is not productive. We have to look at the direction where things are going and how to make best use of or how to adapt to this kind of new transformations. Thank you.
Thank you for these reflections. I think this is an excellent moment to look at Menti and the kind of results and kind of inputs we received there. What is interesting, what we see, or what I see at the core, is a little bit of an emphasis on social media, but then if we dive deeper, it's very interesting. We have some qualities and practices that are very much related to qualities of diplomats and diplomatic practice, openness, competency, authority, reciprocity, accountability, transparency, again, exchange, conflict resolution. So in my opinion, this goes back to the core functions of diplomacy, but we also have kind of more concrete, perhaps, topics or issues that are on the agenda. So where did I see this? Agenda building, cyberspace, cross-border challenges, policy. There was artificial intelligence, data governance. And from that perspective, perhaps I want to turn back to the panel with a last question. Part of the conversation focused on digital as a tool for diplomatic practice. At the same time, and we alluded to this a number of times, diplomats are also really impacting the governance of digital, be it on AI, data, or other issues. So we mentioned an early example, which was the World Summit on the Information Society. We also alluded to this question, do we need a broader digital contract between different countries? There are many examples also in the area of cybersecurity where diplomats are negotiating the kind of conditions under which digital, very broadly understood, can take place. So my question is, what is the ability of diplomats to shape that, to shape the environment in which digital, be it data, AI, or in the area of cybersecurity is practiced? Because we talk a lot about diplomats absorbing digital as a tool for their practice, but at the same time, I think my ideal would be to give back a little bit of power and say, yes, but they're also in a position to shape this discussion and to bring different views together and to come to global consensus on some of the key issues on how we want to see the future develop in this area. So my question for you is basically, what is the potential for diplomats to kind of shape these discussions? Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, I'd just like to clarify something with Cornelio and the ambassador. Actually, I want diplomats to be using digital technology, but I want them to be using it much better. I want them to be much more innovative about shaping the digital technologies and AI and other technologies to what we need to do in diplomacy. I mean, I'm still stunned that policymaking in foreign ministries is still essentially the same as when I first joined the Foreign Office in the Cold War. It hasn't really changed. And with all the technologies we've got for simulation exercises, for using gamification to explore policymaking, policy space, I think that's a far more interesting place to go. And I'm disappointed that foreign ministries haven't gone there yet. I think the COVID, I think as Cornelia suggested, has broken a taboo about doing diplomacy online to a lot many more interesting areas that can be explored. To answer your question, I think we had a problem. We thought that technical issues were technical problems. That when we looked at cyberspace, internet governance, problems of content, cybersecurity, that all of these issues were technical issues and would have technical solutions, and we could leave it to the techies. I don't think that's true. That's no more true than physical security should be left to soldiers. Clemenceau once famously said, war is too serious to leave to generals. I think cyberspace is far too important to leave to the techies. So we need diplomats in there. We need to recognize that the problems of cyberspace, whether we're talking about internet governance or we talk about cybersecurity, are essentially geopolitical problems. And because they're geopolitical problems, we need diplomats engaged trying to manage them. We've seen what goes wrong when we leave it, for example, to internet companies to come up with algorithms on unacceptable content. You start getting photographs of the napalmed girl in Vietnam running down the street being censored because the algorithm thinks it's child pornography. These are issues that we need human debate about, whether it's data, as Cornelia says, data transfer across borders. All of these areas are highly political, highly geopolitical issues, and the diplomats need to get engaged. And these diplomats need to learn some of the technology. They don't need to learn how to code, although I hope all young people can know how to code today, but they do need to be sufficiently engaged with the technology that they can understand the technical aspects of what are political and geopolitical issues.
Thank you. Thank you. Perhaps also, because we're slowly running out of time for the first panel, also time for final reflections. But with this theme of diplomats as shaping the process also in mind, Cornelio, final reflections from you on this.
I think it's a dual process. Some of them are better than others in terms of setting the agenda. I like to mention, I mean, the Israeli MFA always been very, very far in terms of how to integrate the offline and the online quite well. I always use them as an example. But I think what is interesting to see how the environment is shaping the profession. What do I mean by this? And I'm going back to Sean's point about, the skills that diplomats need actually as we move forward. If we go back to 1950s or 60s, what do you need? How do you recruit a diplomat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? Must have a good knowledge of economics, political science, maybe law, maybe, history. These were the type of things that you require from a diplomat when you interview. I think things are moving now in terms of, having not, as Sean said, nobody asked diplomats to code, but to understand data, to read data, to be able not to tweet, but to use data, to understand what is a signal and what is a white noise in order to be able to respond. Also highlight one element that I mentioned before, speed. Speed is key to this transformation. Who has the ability to adapt? And I've been wondering, I can turn it back, to you or Sean or the other, how actually train people to react to speedy transformations by throwing them into the middle of the experience, probably. But I think speed has become the defining feature of this digital trajectory. And I don't think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as Sean mentioned, are still stuck in the past. I have really come to terms with the idea of speed of the transformation.
Interesting question, but also a challenge for all of us who are interested in capacity development and kind of the how, what do diplomats need to know, how can we support these processes. But over to Ambassador Agivaili for his final reflections, but perhaps also this question, how can diplomats shape this process?
Thank you very much, Kat, and thank you for all the speakers. So I'd like to maybe share a few last thoughts. So one of all, is it exclusive? Is it traditional diplomacy or is it digital diplomacy? And I think the answer, it's not one or the other. It's not the launch or the tweet. In fact, it's the launch and the tweet. It's what's discussed on the launch. Of course, what menu the launch is, that's very important in diplomacy, culinary diplomacy, but also the tweet that's after. And I tell you, for example, the more we start to tweet about our daily activity, just at least the form, just the event, just the action, the more even the public, which is usually critical of diplomacy, particularly, back home, they see that we work. Otherwise they think we're either smoking cigars or drinking receptions. But if they see that in one day, an ambassador meets probably 5 to 6, before COVID at least, 5 to 6 meetings with different, in culture, in economic, in diplomacy, and in other issues, the public feels assured that their taxpayer money is actually well invested in those diplomats that they're sending abroad. The second thing they want us to share, and it's also in the 1996 paper, that there is more than one diplomacy. There's obviously intergovernmental diplomacy, what foreign ministries do. There's commercial diplomacy. There's parliamentary diplomacy. There's people-to-people diplomacy, and each of these layers of interaction between international actors through diplomacy has been impacted differently by the information age and its challenges and its opportunities. But also here, I want to raise the issue that it's also a lot about not only those different forms of diplomacy, but the different diplomatic cultures. In fact, different even professional, personal ability to utilize those tools and those and to interact and to engage on these issues and to interact with that environment. And here, the issue of bureaucracy, of administration, of professional culture is incredibly important, especially that there are more than one actor dealing in diplomacy. Again, different institutions, but also different people. So how we can integrate that? It's not about technology, it's about the management. It's about the professional culture, managing and governing that form of interaction. Finally, if you want me to share personal meaning, professional experience, and I hope that Jovan can testify to this. Without ICTs, my 4 years job in Belgrade, in Serbia, would have been either impossible or much less impactful than it were. A small embassy as the one that I am honored to lead would have not been able to increase its reach and to diversify its activities to the extent that we did, and I hope we did a good job, Jovan and all my Serbian friends who are on this panel, if we didn't have the ICT tools. as simple as email and maybe as risky as social media, but also sometimes as sophisticated as other form of platforms. I can assure you from a practitioner's view, at least in those 4 years, that ICTs are and could be and should be enhancing for the diplomat rather than diminishing from his or her role. On that note, I hand to you, Kat.
Thank you so much. Your comment, it's both the lunch and the tweet, has been picked up in the chat, and it's actually something very, very tweetable. And Sean Rierden reflected, he says it's both. He thinks just make sure you have the lunch first and then the tweet. But to close this panel, also because you've just been mentioned, Jovan, final reflections and comments.
Well, just with one anecdote about Amar's point. One journalist asked me from Serbia, what are geostrategical interests of Egypt in Serbia? Amr is so successful diplomat, he's a big star of diplomatic community in Belgrade, that people started asking what are the interests of Egypt. Obviously, Egypt has bilateral interests, but it shows really how the social media can amplify impact in this interplay. And I think one underlying comment is that we are putting it bit binary, bit digitally, this dilemma, either or. And there are really shade of gray. Yes, we need to use digital, it's writing on the wall. We have a new generation, which is basically digital by default, coming into diplomatic services. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't reflect on and keep reminding everybody on the core functions of diplomacy, as Sean has been pushing for, and I can echo it completely. Therefore, that's wisdom of this transition, a wisdom of analog approach, not digital approach or either or to conclude either lunch or tweet. It's both, but it's not enough to say it's both. We as academic practitioners have to reflect more. What does it mean in practice? Where do you use online? Where do you use in situ? Where you combine and how you combine? And it's probably the biggest challenge ahead of us.
Thank you, Jovan. This is also an excellent lead over to our second panel, this encouragement to kind of reflect more on where is digital, where is the physical practice, and how does it look like in practice? What exactly are we doing? So we're going to have a flying changeover to our second panel with, again, a number of practitioners who will reflect on this question, what are we actually talking about, digital and diplomacy, from a number of perspectives. So I will introduce them in a second. So we named this panel very aptly, I think, diving deeper into practice, diplomats' journeys in digital diplomacy. And I'm extremely happy to introduce you to our speakers for this panel. First, we have Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, who's a former Indian ambassador and Diplo Senior Fellow. We have Ms. Dalia Salinas, who is a Mexican diplomat working at the Embassy of Mexico to the United Kingdom in Norway. We have Ms. Nanjira Sambuli, who is a fellow of Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace. She is a non-diplomat, and she is going to give us this perspective of how do non-diplomats in this environment of diplomacy experience the process, and what advice would they give and what perspective do they have? And then last but not least, we will also hear further reflections from our director, Dr. Jovan Kubalia. But without further ado, I actually want to go straight into the discussion with a question for Ambassador Mukherjee, Ashok. You look back on a very rich working life as a senior diplomat. So from that perspective, I would like to ask you to share some personal reflections regarding digital diplomacy, because I assume as your career progressed, digital diplomacy broadly understood actually got more and more attention. So how did you perceive that, and what are your reflections, kind of again looking back in order to look ahead?
Well, thank you, Katharina, and thank you everybody at Diplo, Jovan, for inviting me. Your question is actually a trip back in memory, down memory lane, but also looking to the future. I was fortunate, and I think that the first panel really explained this interaction. I was fortunate to be exposed to the technology in my career, and I was never educated in this. I don't come from a technical background. And when I started negotiating in the World Trade Organization on basic telecommunications in February 1997, we were all introduced to something called a reference paper and the idea of spectrum. And I remember when I took this issue of spectrum to my ambassador in Geneva, and he said, spectrum is something that is dealt with by the Defense Ministry and it's nothing to do with us. So that was the reaction that we got in 1997. And today, look where spectrum has taken us. Spectrum is 5G and beyond, and it's part of our daily life. The second impact, and that was probably Jovan would call an academic or intellectual impact, was that of the Clinton White House, who sent a person called Ira Magaziner to us negotiating in Geneva and introduced us to the concept of information technology. And that resulted in the first ministerial of the WTO adopting an information technology agreement. And when India decided to weigh the pros and cons and become part of the information technology agreement, it brought the concept into practice, because we were desperately looking for a new product or a new area to improve and increase our economic and export profile away from textiles and agriculture products. And this was something that was identified by us as a priority: software exports. So it was basically to generate software exports by importing hardware, which we never produced at that time, at 0% tariff. And that was why India entered the information technology agreement. And the results of that came in the next decade. And today we are probably the largest software exporter in the world. So this was the combination of experience, of ideas, and of diplomacy, because the diplomacy was negotiating the best possible terms for us in the international arena. And then I look back at the core issues, as Ambassador Al-Jawaili would have put it, of security and technology. And that came into my life in November 2008, when for the first time ever, I was posted in London at that time, the first time ever voice over internet protocol was used to conduct a terrorist attack on Mumbai. And a lot of diplomats didn't know what to do with this dimension, because this was something that was new. But today that has grown exponentially. I mean, we look at the use of cyber technologies and terrorism and how to counter it. It's become part and parcel of a diplomat's job. And I think that this was something that that grounded me. And it was again London which played a very big role in introducing me to a topic which is probably central to diplomacy, which is the principle of international cooperation. Since 1919, the world has moved on how to implement the principle of international cooperation to make the best for every country in this framework. And the London conference, the global conference on cyberspace, the first one took place in 2011. I was part of that from the Indian delegation. And then I participated in that process until we held the last one in New Delhi in 2017. And that has created in me an awareness of the issues which bring together the nuts and bolts of how digital diplomacy plays a role in transforming our own country, but also plays a role in transforming the world we live in, and probably also identifies the challenges that lie ahead of us. And I think that in that context, there are two areas which have influenced me when I was ambassador to the United Nations in New York, and that those are the use of digital technology for accelerating sustainable development. And that is something that is very important. But I think most of the negotiators in New York were not focused. There were only 3 or 4 countries including mine. We were speaking for it, and we got a technology facilitation mechanism out of that process. But that has to be implemented and expanded, and I hope it will be in the coming 5 or 6 years, given all the ideas which we've heard in the first panel. And the second was the review of the Tunis agenda for creating the World Information Society. And again, the central role of technology in bridging the divides, in empowering people. I mean, you see the outcome of that first review of December 2015, and you get an entire menu of what we are trying to achieve in using in digital diplomacy. And for me today, as a person who is involved in teaching about these issues, I think that this experience has really given me a very big grounding. And I am grateful to my profession for having enabled me to learn on the job. As I said, I was never taught all these things. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these reflections with many interesting examples. And I must confess, some of the things also new to me, to kind of really show how digital came into the diplomatic process. So that was an absolute pleasure to listen to this kind of rich overview of so many interesting examples. If I may, I would like to now go to a diplomat from a younger generation, if I may say so. And this brings me to Dalia Salinas. And I would like to know from you, what are your reflections on all of the things you heard so far? And I know at the Mexican embassy, you have this focus on innovation and on really harnessing the potential of digital tools. So from what I understand, this is always close to your heart and to your practice. But overall, what are your reflections so far, as I said, as this diplomat from a younger generation?
Thank you, Katarina. Thank you, Jovan. Thank you, everybody, for having me today here at this very stimulating conversation. Well, the first thing that I want to share with you is how the reason why many of my colleagues, young diplomats, ended up, I think, pushing the agenda of using social media and talking about digital in the ministries was because we were, I'm sorry. Una hora. Gracias. I'm very sorry. It's because we are working as diplomats at the same time that we are growing with technology. The way we relate to each other, with our peers, with our friends, with our families, is becoming increasingly digitalized. And we discover the potential for our work. But I think this is what I had in mind when I read Jovan's blog. And I really like the categories that he is proposing for us. He brings digital diplomacy, and he brings tools, topics, and the environment. What I would say, and I am with Sean on this, is that we have to be very careful not to miss the point. This is about diplomacy. What I would suggest to think is that it's not digital diplomacy, but diplomacy, and it has tools that can be, of course, Twitter or the email or databases. And there are topics that diplomacy in general talks about, including technology itself as a topic. And the environment. The environment of diplomacy nowadays is digital. We are in the 4th industrial revolution. And when we understand it like that, I think digital diplomacy is just diplomacy. Diplomacy as a very ancient practice that has been essential for the survival and the evolution of human groups has to evolve itself, something that Cornelio has just mentioned before. And we recently published an article that actually was named The Co-Evolution of Diplomacy After the Corona Crisis. And this is because we understand that diplomacy, as Sean just mentioned, its virtues, it's the reason why it's so valuable for society everywhere in the world, that hasn't changed a bit. But the environment, the tools, and the topics now are different. So the evolution, and this is something that I really liked about Ilan's participation when he explained how technology is adopted by ministries of foreign affairs. I totally agree with him. I recognize what he mentioned, but there is also another issue, which is we don't do that in isolation. We do not adapt, we do not use Twitter in isolation. Twitter becomes a thing because our peers are using it as well. So there is a co-evolution of this. And we won't go to artificial intelligence if not other Ministry of Foreign Affairs is doing it so. And if we are not seeing it as something that has to be done to actually achieve a diplomatic objective. So just to keep it super brief, and just as an introduction, I would say, yes, we have to understand digital as the condition of the environment. In the fourth industrial revolution, diplomacy has to evolve. And the way it evolves is in a cooperating way. We have to be open to other sectors. We have to be open to different perspectives and to bring new topics to the agenda. But that's something that diplomacy has done for ages. We just have to understand how it works in the digital era. But that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this reminder that in the end it's all about diplomacy. Perhaps we can even use an analogy here when we look at digital art. In the end, it is art, an ancient practice, just like diplomacy. I would like to turn to our third panelist in this round, and I think here gets really interesting because she is not a diplomat, but very well experienced in diplomatic processes. And here I'm talking about the UN Secretary General's panel on digital cooperation. So Nanjira Sambuli, turning to you, I would basically like to ask you what are your experiences as a non-diplomat in the world of diplomacy? How did you experience that world? And perhaps even, well, what are your reflections, but also perhaps your advice for other non-diplomats who are entering this world of diplomacy?
Thanks, Katharina. And following from Dalia's excellent point, it's still about those core functions of diplomacy, right? It's still about negotiation, representation, and navigating the information communication environment as it's changing. But one of the most interesting experiences I've had is this conflation of the use of digital tools for diplomacy and digital technologies as a subject matter for diplomacy. And this has sort of undermined conceptual clarity on what we're referring to when we speak of digital diplomacy. And a big shift is that in the reality that we're operating in today, you have private sector architects of digitalization as core influencers of this digital and diplomacy nexus. So are civil society, academia, the technical community, alongside states around whom traditional diplomacy is centered. Now, navigating this new dispensation is a very interesting challenge for the practice of diplomacy today. One interesting evolution there is that there's a reverence for the private sector players predominantly and their positions on salient issues. And this is skewing how we navigate what I call the diplomacy of digitalization. And the challenge, again, of addressing cross-jurisdictional issues pertaining to these technologies, using diplomatic tools and techniques that were designed for representation along jurisdictional lines is a very interesting one. For instance, the topic of digital and cyber sovereignty, without going into the definitional aspect, is a concept that should concern states, companies, civil society, academia, technical communities alike. The question then becomes, do we have the diplomacy avenues to actually accommodate this reality? On a more personal level, I'm a Kenyan, for instance, but I'm not a representative of Kenyan government or a Kenyan company in that sense, nor am I the African representative, in which many people try to sort of box me into. But I am somebody who's a scholar and a researcher and a practitioner on issues from a local perspective of global import. Now, I'm one of many of practitioners who will be emerging in a space like this, that these spaces that are transcending what we understand as traditional avenues for doing representation, communication, and negotiation of issues or for stakeholder groups. Another observation for me has been that this space is still dominated by Western expertise. It's not yet carved out as well for younger people for whom we are the bulk of the population that is being impacted by digitalization. and non-Western perspectives, which are very rich, not just in in what digitalization has to offer, but in sort of the international relations theories and ideologies, have not yet been accommodated, even when we're talking about digitalization as a sort of after effect of globalization as well. And often what happens is we come in as an afterthought, framed on that, oh, we need to include the developing countries or China or India, or under development. These are development practitioners. So the world in that sense is still centered around the West. And then there's the rest who are brought in. So at this point, I'll say one of the most interesting things, and I always harp on this, is that the technical and the technological is very much geopolitical. And this is really, really important for how we shape the approach to the diplomacy of digitalization. And so for all those younger people who are thinking about this, who are affected by this, who feel whether it's states or companies or institutions as they're currently configured, do not speak for them, start to speak up, start to write about it, start to articulate it as a starting point, because we are the ones who are going to be inheriting this earth, and we have to figure out how to rejig these institutions, but it starts by speaking up loudly and proudly and critically as necessary.
Thank you so much for these reflections. I really, really appreciate it. When we look at internet governance or digital diplomacy, we of course see that there are many different kinds of actors that diplomats need to interact with, but that are using the diplomatic toolbox and that are gaining prominence and voices, and in the case of big tech companies, of course, also quite a lot of power. What I found really interesting, and important to kind of underscore, you mentioned this imbalance that right now we have a lot of voices from the West in these kind of conversations. Do you have any suggestions on how to start addressing this, or perhaps how to, what would be things we could do to start addressing this, even on a conceptual basis? Because I think there's a lot of things missing, and therefore we don't even see the full picture when it comes to digital diplomacy. And essentially there is a policy in politics that is geared towards very specific constituencies, which in the end is not really helpful for anyone. So any suggestions, and I know this is a difficult question, but any suggestions towards addressing this from your side?
Sure. Really quickly, it's funny. What has happened is, well, this is starting to be realized that we need to hear non-Western perspectives. We need to bring more room, create more room on the table. It's still in a very, I'd call it problematically piecemeal way, where you have this notion, you bring one person from India, one person from Africa, usually it's not even a specific country, one person from the global, from Latin America, with the global South representatives. And there's such a wideness of perspectives. So it first even goes back to how the international order and international relations ideologies have been shaped. One area that's going to be fascinating and is going to create a lot of interesting tension going forward is this sort of separation of rights issues. So a lot of the West want to focus on political or civil rights, but the others really think about the economic and social just part and parcel of what we talk about as rights when we talk about digital rights or just human rights in the traditional sense. So when we come to that table, included from time allocation that is given to speak to the richness of these issues, to the work that we have to take on of trying to bring people up to speed with the richness of theories and ideologies and praxis from such a diverse place as the global South, really does mean we have to change how we operate these spaces. It's not just enough anymore to say you have people on the table. The table itself has to be reconfigured. And this is where the twin problems of the analog and the digital blurring are creating such a potent issue here. There are theories that have to be understood from that age that comes before the digital. There's the how we're experiencing digital. We may not be the creators of the AI tools, but we are either the guinea pigs where they're tested out. I always tell people, Cambridge Analytica cut its teeth in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa way before it went into the UK and the US. How that impacted us and how we deal with issues such as information influence or operational influence on the cyberspace should be informing how policies, norms, you name it, the instruments that are trying to be shaped at the international level are being designed. But a lot of that, for that to happen, we cannot just continue using the tools or the methodologies or the practices that have been in the last hundreds of years to imagine that you can suddenly bring us on and we'll just carry on with the train as it's been going. At some point, the train has to stop and take a break and then reconfigure its path going forward.
Thank you so much. I would actually like to take this point and just ask the other panelists, and perhaps starting with Jovan and then the other panelists to reflect on exactly that point. So first over to you, Jovan. In the chat, you wrote something in the chat on which I really liked. It's a question of moving from formal inclusion to substantive inclusion. So over to you.
Sure, Kat, great points from our three contributors from different perspectives. What is the key in the last comment by Nanjira is that we have a still naive view that internet is global and it can be only regulated globally. This is not the case. Internet is global as a network, but the impact of the internet is very often local. As Nanjira said, and she was eloquently arguing, for example, on digital identity during the panel on the high that it's different impact of digital identity or collecting data in the countries with strong data protection law comparing to countries with weak data protection law. Therefore, this is the first point. Yes, it's global, but impact and governance is very often local. And I think it's a very valid point. Second point, and Sean brought it, and I think it has to be addressed. We have complete asymmetry in inputs from other regions and countries. Politically, more or less, countries go to the UN, and Ashoke told us how he participates, but very little in shaping thinking about diplomacy in general and digital diplomacy in particular. And we have great traditions. People negotiated in Africa, they negotiated in India, they had a great, with Kaitula, great negotiating systems. Therefore, there's a need for more academic and policy modesty and reflecting the views and bringing the views from other sides. I'll give you one example. Kenyans invented M-Pesa as a great e-banking tool. All articles, if you search on the internet, are written by people from other parts, especially from the United States and UK. There is a need for those people who invented it to be more visible on Google, at least on the first page. They write it, but it's another problem that Google basically favors certain part of the views. And then the second point, which is becoming increasingly important, is, for example, standardization, big negotiations. Many small countries and African countries absent. China is moving in, and it's one of the source of a lot of controversial discussions. We are conducting the study on the standardization and digital governance. It will be ready in November, analyzing how the standards are created, because standards are behind the technology. And the great point on the it is just diplomacy. I think it's a very, very powerful statement, and I can strongly, Dalia, support it. And that's it. It's just diplomacy. And what is happening currently in Geneva? E-commerce, digital health, cybersecurity are evolving from the separate fields, mainstreaming into international organizations. And it is going to be the major change in multilateralism and concretely what's going on in Geneva, New York, and other places. And that will be a return to the core interplay between change and continuity. This is this analog interplay. Change of tools, change of forums, but continuity in the core functions of diplomacy. Now we have, as academics and practitioners, to dive deeper into logic of this change, and definitely avoiding binary view of either or, as I think has been this message to avoid binary view has been echoing through all presentations today, and I think that is important message.
Thank you. Ashok, what is your reaction to some of the things we just discussed, and in particular this question of inclusion?
Well, first I'd like to also agree with what Dalia has said, that it is just diplomacy and we need to use this as a tool, the technologies that are now available, and be aware of it. Nanjira's point is, for me, the most important point, that the table has to be reconfigured. And, you know, we have been talking about it in the traditional diplomatic world. I have spent a lot of time on, say, reconfiguring the table of the Security Council of the United Nations to no great success. But the way the world is now transforming because of the technologies that have come, which have impacted on the nature of states, of behavior, of various things that make up the ingredients of diplomacy. I think that the reconfiguration of and of bringing in the experiences and the voices, because without experience, the voices don't make any sense. So you have to bring the experiences as well as the voices of what used to be called the global south, but I don't use that anymore because it's each country which is not part of the traditional diplomatic elite, which has contributed in the last 200 years these ideas and theories, has its own role. And now we have new experiences which have to be brought in. I have been part of a dialogue on decolonization in the University of East Anglia, which happened over the summer. And we have tried to introduce a curriculum based on decolonization. What does it mean to be a decolonized, to study from a perspective of a decolonized society and a country? Now that can only come from a country which has been colonized, because it can't be written by the person who colonized you. So therefore, I think that this point that Nanjira made is very important, and I would fully support it. And in terms of how this can work, which is something that I think we constantly think of, I think there are three lessons that I picked up in my career. One is the importance of networking. I think that there is no substitute for networking. Even if one sits behind a computer and thinks that one knows everything, you really don't know everything. And that coffee and that lunch and the tweet idea actually is a very important idea. I think the lunch is as important as the tweet, because networking is important. I would have never known of Spectrum if it hadn't been for my Brazilian friend with whom I was having coffee, and he gave me the paper. So that's the kind of networking that helps. The second is to be aware of the technologies. If we are not aware, we shut down ourselves to the developments that are taking place. And a lot of traditional diplomacy suffers from this resistance to acknowledging that there's change happening. I think that's important. And the last, and that's where Sean's point is so important, the last is, don't forget, what is all this meant for? I would argue that this entire thing is meant for improving the human condition. I mean, I know it sounds very utopian, but that's the first resolution of the General Assembly on ICTs in 1998, that this is all meant to serve humanity. So we have now reached a point where we are being distracted by the new gizmos, the new jargon and everything. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to human beings. And I think that that's the important thing I'd like to convey. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So there is something else underlying the core function of diplomacy. And thank you so much for reminding us. In the end, it's about creating a better world. Daya, you've been nodding quite vigorously. So over to you for reflections and comments on this.
Thank you. Yes, no, well, of course. I mean, this is fascinating. And I agree with Ambassador Mukherjee. This is, we don't have to miss the point of what diplomacy is all about. And I think some people think it's utopian to think this is for the good of humanity, but let's phrase it in a different way. Let's say this is about generating public value. And our aim as diplomats, professional diplomats, and this is something that I was putting on the chat, Jovan, when we say this is just diplomacy, this is hiding a fascinating moment, I think. And this is what many of us are not addressing properly, because we get distracted with the tools and with certain products, digital products that are in the market. But diplomacy is in a moment of professionalization. It's a very ancient practice, but its professionalization is super recent. It's very, very recent. And we are still in that process of becoming professionalized. And we are doing this in the moment of the fourth industrial revolution. So for many ministries of foreign affairs, just like Cornelius said, they're making these questions like, okay, how does I identify? How does a good potential diplomat looks like nowadays? How should I recruit them? What kind of training should I give them? This is something that Diplo is, this is in the business of Diplo. It's in the core of your organization, for instance. What is that makes a diplomat effective nowadays and for the next 25 years? And this is a super important question for MFAs all around the world, because you have to allocate resources, you have to train people, you have to recruit talent. And some of that talent is not the usual kind of talent. Now, you probably need people that understand technology, but not so much of international law. And how are you going to profit from that expertise? And this is about inclusion as well. Nigeria, thank you. Super on point. Amazing, amazing contribution. Thank you. And I agree. I mean, diplomacy, the professionalization of diplomacy is also facing the challenge of becoming more open to a wider array of inputs and participants. And this also means, one of my favorite agendas, and Katarina knows this, the participation of women. We need more women. We need more female perspectives in the profession and in the agendas and in the way the agendas are addressed. But not only women, people from different backgrounds, from different perspectives. So fostering this kind of conversations, just like Diplo is doing right now, in which we have to contrast our viewpoints, is basic and so relevant for moments in which the echo chamber is becoming the norm. And this is exactly, it goes against the purpose of diplomacy. Diplomacy needs to be open and to be willing of contrasting opinions and to find solutions of mutual benefit, but always aiming for public value. That's something that we should stress, and I cannot stress it enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Much like Ashok, Ambassador Mukherjee, very uplifting words in a way, but also giving us a very concrete agenda on what to do next. Almost final words, although we're not quite there yet. One thing I wanted to draw your attention on is the discussion in the chat, and then interesting parallel discussion happened on exclusion and inclusion and kind of setting the rules of the game. In this case, on hybrid diplomacy, this idea that meetings take place in situ, so a physical meeting, but some participants take part in the meeting by virtual means. And there's this question: how can we make sure that participants who are meeting physically in the same space and those that join virtually are on a relatively equal footing? And Nigeria shared a very practical concern, namely that in hubs like New York and Geneva, of course, we're seeing the re-emergence of a lot of physical meetings, but with vaccine politics the way they are and the questions around the recognition of certain vaccines, there's a real challenge for representatives from the Global South to actually be able to travel to these meetings. But then if we move hybrid, then there's a question of having them on an equal footing. And Nigeria, you posted a link to some reflections from you, but basically, could I ask you to share some of those, or to give us a little bit of a intro into that topic, because I think it's very important as we're moving into this world of hybrid diplomacy, or even like praising the possibility of hybrid diplomacy.
Yeah, a very important starting point for what will shape as the diplomacy of digitalization is the concept of digital equality or digital inequalities. All things being equal, if we were talking about everybody participating virtually or in a hybrid setting, it would be one thing. But we know that none of that, we don't get to that moment where we have an event that is hybrid or in person without the politics of who can get to where the venue is, who gets the platform to speak, and so on and so forth. I wrote a reflection a while back, deep in the heart of virtual webinars, around also the choice of platforms, given the realities that for a lot of people, internet access is not just this thing you plug and play. If you use a platform, for example, that does not have servers that are well distributed, the bundles, the bandwidth that it will demand from somebody in a less connected space is very different. And if they're supposed to be participating or contributing to a high-level panel, you can imagine those disruptions. So that becomes almost an exclusion by design or by inadvertent design based on the choice of platforms. These are the considerations that should be happening when people are talking about hybrid conferences as trying to get the best of both. And this was already a huge criticism of or critique of IGF that Jovan was giving examples of, even before COVID. Who was left behind trying to participate virtually, and what kind of spaces really, or how many rooms could they get into? You know, the whole idea is if there's a conversation happening here or in the next room, I should be able to move both. It's a very different experience when that's how you have parallel sessions in hybrid or virtual settings. These are the dynamics that we don't all have this universal, meaningful connectivity. And it's absolutely going to affect who can participate, who gets to be heard, when and how. And we need to keep this in mind. And it's something I wrote with a conference of organizers in mind.
Thank you. And I think it's a good reminder that a lot of the technology we use and a lot of decisions we make around that are highly political, leading to inclusion and exclusion. So we have to keep a very, very close eye on that in order to make better decisions and basically create a better world, as Ambassador Mukherjee mentioned. We're almost out of time. From my perspective, it's been 2 very intense hours, very interesting discussion, extremely active chat. So let me just quickly say thank you to our audience for sharing your views, for participating in the conversation, by submitting your questions, by furthering the discussion in the chat, which actually has become a very valuable resource, which we will draw on in the summary for this event. Because we're almost at the end, what I would like to do is invite our panelists of the second panel for their final reflections. And I heard many wise words from them, which are already perfect final reflections. But maybe one more time, final reflections from you in terms of, perhaps even in terms of looking back in order to look ahead. What shall we take from this event, and what should be the key message or the key thought we can take after 2 hours of intense discussion? So I would like to go in the same order as before. So that would be Ashok, Ambassador Mukherjee. So over to you for some final words.
Well, Kat, and I have listened to all the speakers today, and I followed some of the chat. And I think that one of the most important takeaways that I have, and it's something that I've argued for myself, is that we need to approach this entire topic as a multiple stakeholder topic. We can't leave it only to governments to lead the way, or even to companies to lead the way. This has to be a multiple stakeholder exercise. And I think the challenge we face is, how do you make it a multiple stakeholder exercise? Given my own experience of having done Agenda 2030 as a multiple stakeholder exercise, and the review of the Tunis agenda as a multiple stakeholder exercise, there have been, the other stakeholders, which are not governments, have not really been able to participate. So is it something that we now need to address in terms of digital diplomacy? How can we make it an effective, equal, as Nanjira said, equal participatory process? That is, I think, the most important challenge before us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Dalia.
Thank you very much. Well, what I would say is thank you for reminding us, Jovan, about the Vienna Conventions, both of them. What I would say is, let's go back to basics. Let's go back to the main sources of the incipient codification of our practice, and try to imagine how it should be working in the digital age. And let's continue the conversation in places, in forums like this, to listen and get a better grasp of how a good co-evolution of diplomacy should look like. I don't think any of us have the best or the correct answer, but I think that together we can approach to or approximate better to what it should look like in the near future. And this is essential because the global challenges that we are facing, the corona crisis, I think, is just a tiny example, but there are big, big issues at stake. And diplomacy is now more needed than ever. It's urgent to have an effective diplomacy everywhere in the world that can generate the public value that is needed to save humanity from very real and imminent threats. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nanjira, over to your, not final words, but reflections for now and inspiration for what we can take from this event.
Dalia took the words right out of my mouth. was going to say, never have we needed diplomacy than now, the moment we're living in, when the tools to get us closer to conflict are easier, they're digitalized, you know, and the technology can be weaponized easily. We need to bring back and to rejuvenate the practice and the institution of diplomacy to really help us navigate this turbulent waters. On one hand, it's very much about bringing the practice of diplomacy towards the use of these tools, but more importantly, having the institution of diplomacy shape the conversations further upstream in policy and governance, even before we have some of these technologies sort of meeting out all sorts of chaos in the world. We need that move and shift, and this institution does definitely have a place to play and a role to fulfill in helping us navigate where we're headed to.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed those 2 hours of conversation with all of you. And towards the end, I also had the sense of inspiration and kind of really giving the why we are asking this question of digital and diplomacy, why we are trying to reduce confusion and how to go forward. So thank you with a lot of appreciation for all of your insights. And from my side, only 2 quick things to follow up. First, we will provide a summary of this conversation. We will attempt it, and it will be, I think, quite long to do justice to all of this. We will also take into consideration all the information that has been shared in the chat. So you also get a lot of additional resources in the follow-up. And really, all that's left for me to say is I'm deeply humbled for having the opportunity to chair such a conversation. And we will follow up, and thank you so much both to our fantastic speakers, but also to you, the audience, for taking the time to join us and for really contributing to the discussion in such a rich way. Thank you so much.